Hello everyone, I'm Sarxos, and this is a post-commentary of my Victoria 2 Form India in-game time speedrun. On the speedrunning leaderboards for this game, there are actually two subcategories for India. One is any percent, which allows you to, for example, start as a UK and then later switch to play as an Indian minor using the release and play mechanic, but releasing and switching to play as India directly still doesn't count as forming them. The other is no R plus P, which specifically bans the release and play mechanic, so you have to play as an Indian minor from the beginning. My speedrun was done in the latter category, where I started as Punjab. India is one of the hardest nations to form in the vanilla game, because all Indian minors start as uncivilized countries, and part of the run requires you to kick the United Kingdom out of the subcontinent. Of all eligible candidates, Punjab is by far in the best position to do this. Not only are they the largest and strongest of all Indian miners by a decent margin, but they are also one of the few that are fully independent from the British. On top of that, they start partially westernized and with a few military perks that most uncivs lack. Most notably the ability to recruit regular infantry rather than just irregulars. Still, even with these advantages, it's not going to be an easy task, so let's get into it. Step 1. Westernization. While becoming westernized isn't technically a requirement, you'll have a very rough time trying to liberate India from the British without doing it. Trust me, I tried. To do this as efficiently as possible, it's good to understand just how the mechanics of westernization works in this game. To become westernized, you first need to reach 100% westernization progress. Westernization progress is gained by passing military or economic reforms, with each reform granting between 10 and 25% progress each, along with a few other bonuses. Passing reforms cost research points, which typically can only be acquired by passively waiting for them to accumulate based on your daily research point generation. Base research point generation is primarily affected by your proportion of clergy pops and your average literacy, with various potential modifiers increasing that base gain further, most notably plurality. So at first glance, the most efficient way to westernize is simply to promote clergy and fund education as much as possible to increase your literacy, and otherwise just wait for research points to trickle in so you can pass the reforms you need. But at a few more glances, there actually is a way to speed up this process considerably, namely through conquest. For reasons that were presumably motivated more by gameplay convenience than realism, the devs implemented a mechanic that lets uncivs gain bonus research points by conquering territory from other nations. The amount of research points gained is roughly equal to the number of provinces conquered times the daily research gain after the conquest times 360. So contrary to what a lot of people might think, the number of pops in the conquered territory does not directly affect the amount of research points gained, but it may indirectly have an impact since those new pops could alter the proportion of clergy as well as the average literacy of your country, thus changing your daily research point generation, which in turn affects the amount of research points gained. There is one caveat to this mechanic though. You need to have passed at least one of the first 4 military reforms to get any research points from conquest. That's because the first 4 military reforms include a plus 25% research points when conquering modifier, and you need at least one such modifier to gain any research points on conquest at all. Based on my own experimentation though, it seems the modifier is a bit broken, since passing any further military reforms past the first one won't actually increase the amount of research points you gain, even though it looks like it should. I'm not entirely sure why, but it's good to know about. Since the vast majority of uncivs start with no reforms at all, most of them will just have to sit and wait for passive research point generation until they can pass the first military reform. But Punjab just so happens to belong to the small group of uncivs that actually have a few military reforms unlocked from the start, which enables them to instantly benefit from research points on conquest, on top of starting at 20% westernization progress. With that in mind, the first step of the run is to go out in search of territory to conquer. But since the research points gained is based on the number of provinces taken, none of our immediate neighbors are very efficient targets when considering infamy. So the first thing I do is get military access to Sindh and then cancel it after moving my armies there, thus making them exiled. Then I can freely move them all the way over to, surprise surprise, Korea. Korea is one of the most efficient targets to conquer when considering research points versus infamy gain, as they have 19 provinces and can be fully annexed with a single conquest war goal for up to 22 infamy. I did have a bit of bad luck in that my war justification against them got discovered almost immediately, so I got basically the full 22 infamy for the war goal. But fortunately, Punjab has a very convenient way to deal with early infamy in the form of two releasable countries, Ladakh and Kashmir. Releasing both of these instantly reduces infamy by 10, and since the states they occupy only make up a very small portion of Punjab's total population, it's not a big deal for me to lose them. After my troops have arrived at the Korean border, I declare the war and proceed to effortlessly beat up the Korean armies and then fully occupy their country. Soon thereafter, I annex Korea, and with a boost in research points, I can take my first reform. But the war isn't over yet, since Korea was allied to China, who have so far remained dormant in their own territory. But now that I suddenly own land right next to them, they awake from their slumber and begin sending waves of armies my way. Poorly trained and poorly led armies, that is, that I can continuously beat up one by one until China finally gives up. I should also mention that during this war, Afghanistan took the opportunity to declare war on me for the core they have on one of my states. I would have been able to recruit new armies in my homeland and fight them off if I wanted to, but instead I opted to instantly surrender and let them take the province. The main reason is that losing a core province like this gives me a bit of revanchism, thus making it easier to add additional war goals in future wars. And I also get a free CB to use against Afghanistan later in case I would want to. Anyway, like I said, conquering Korea is a great way to get research points. But that's actually not the only reason I targeted them. The other reason is to gain some ports in which to build a fleet, which I intend to use to help me fight my next target, Japan. If you watch my recent Texas into USA video, you'll know that I used a strategy of trapping the whole Japanese army on the island of Shikoku using my ships, which then gave me free reign to occupy the rest of the country unopposed. As you can probably guess, that's exactly what I intend to do in this run as well. One problem though is that this time I'm also an unciv, much like Japan, so my navy isn't any stronger than theirs. Furthermore, my ports in Korea are only enough to give me a naval supply limit of 4, and the further I exceed that limit, the greater the supply penalty my ships will suffer. Eventually they won't be able to get any supplies at all, at which point they will be sitting ducks for the Japanese navy. I'm going to need several transport ships to move my army from Korea to Japan, but I also need some warships to ensure I can win any naval engagements. So how can I build a navy large enough to do what I need to do, while also being small enough to still receive supplies? The answer is to start by building 10 transport ships, move an army over to Shikoku to set up the island trap, then once the Japanese army is trapped, I disband most of the transports and replace them with some combat-ready frigates to hold the strait. By building and disbanding ships as needed, I can avoid exceeding the supply limit too much at any one time, thus keeping whatever ships I have in decent condition. To facilitate this, I had actually begun stockpiling clippers and artillery right from the start of the run, so that once I needed a navy, I could begin constructing a bunch of them simultaneously, rather than having to gather up the necessary goods for one ship at a time. With all the naval operations having been successfully completed, the rest of the war was a cakewalk, and I could soon peace out for 2 of Japan's most populated states. The reason I wanted to take stuff from Japan is that the Japanese have some of the highest literacy rates among uncivs in the game, at 40%, which massively exceeds Punjab's own literacy of just 4%. So by incorporating a bunch of Japanese people into my country, my average literacy is immediately bumped up to over 18%. Nearly doubling my daily research point gain. This will significantly increase the value of any future conquests. Those future conquests will have to wait a bit though, as my recent conquests have brought my infamy up to just below the infamy limit. If I were to exceed that limit now, it's likely the UK would respond by containing me to hell and back, so instead I patiently bide my time. But it's not because I need to wait for my infamy to drop lower, as you might expect. Rather, it's to wait for the UK to finally finish putting me into their sphere of influence. With that done, they are no longer able to declare containment wars on me, So in practice, this gives me a get out of jail free card in regards to the infamy limit. I immediately make use of that by justifying a conquest war goal on Dainam, which is another pretty good target for research point farming. When that justification was nearing completion, I once again began constructing a massive transport fleet to ferry my troops from Japan to Dainam. But before construction of said fleet was finished, my truce with Japan ran out and they immediately declared war on me along with their new ally China to retake their course. Fighting them off didn't prove too difficult though, so in the end it only resulted in a minor delay. With that little distraction out of the way, I proceeded to attack Dainam. This war should have been quite easy as well, except that, apparently, my repeated bludgeoning of the Chinese Empire led to them having a revolt at some point, which set all of their substates free, and the second most powerful of those substates, Yunnan, decided to form an alliance with Dainam. This did complicate matters a fair bit, but after a few setbacks I still managed to achieve victory. Through the annexation of Dainam, I had now managed to secure more than enough research points to reach 100% Westernization progress. So all I had to do was wait out the 6 months cooldown between my last two reforms, and then I could officially declare myself a fully westernized nation. This concluded step 1 of the speedrun, which meant it was time to move on to step 2, liberation of British India. By the time I had westernized, my nation score was already high enough to secure a place among the great powers of the world. This would result in me automatically breaking out of the UK's sphere of influence, which removes any obstacle for war between our countries. To avoid having them declare war on me prematurely, I released both Dainam and Korea as vassals to put my infamy well below the infamy limit, which would allow me to justify a few more war goals without exceeding it again. I only really needed to conquer these two kingdoms for the sake of research points, so ceding direct control of the territory isn't a big deal for me, and it has the additional benefit that I won't have to defend those territories from foreign occupation in future wars, something that could otherwise risk ruining my country through war exhaustion. At this point, I'm almost ready to begin the fight for Indian liberation from the British. But first I have to make use of my new westernized technology to recruit a bunch of artillery to complement my current infantry-heavy army and get started on some additional military research. When the time comes to actually declare war though, I preferably want to avoid declaring war on the UK directly, as that would allow them to call their own allies into the war and would also get all their Indian puppets involved. So instead I look around for some minor country that the UK and only the UK is allied to, or which they have in their sphere of influence, and I eventually settle on the small landlocked Boer state of Orange. I justify a humiliate war goal on them and then declare war, which prompts the UK to honour their obligations as sphere leader and join the war as well. As we all know, sometimes the best move is not to move at all, and I take that to heart in the beginning of the war as I let my armies hang back in my own country and bait the UK into invading. Then I gather up my forces and smash their armies to pieces one by one. Once most of their original Indian garrisons have been dealt with, I move forward and begin occupying those parts of India that are under direct British control. Now you might be wondering precisely what I'm looking to demand from the UK in this war. Well, those of you that have watched certain earlier videos of mine, particularly my World Conquest videos, can probably already guess. My goal here is to perform a liberation conquest of India. For those unfamiliar, this is a very useful exploit which involves declaring a conquest war on a one-state minor and simultaneously using a liberate country war goal to release all cores of that nation from a different nation, thus allowing you to conquer all those cores at once. In this case, I'm going to force the UK to release all cores of the nation of India and declare a war to conquer India at the same time. However, there's just one small problem with that plan, namely the fact that the nation of India doesn't even exist yet, so I obviously can't declare a conquest war on them. But fear not, for I have it all planned. After firmly gaining the upper hand over the British, I justify and declare another war on Portugal to release India as a one-province minor from the province of Goa. Portugal is in the Spanish sphere of influence, which brings me into war with Spain as well. but neither of them are much of a threat, and the war goal I'm after only costs a measly 2 war score anyway, so it's a simple matter to just wait until they're willing to give up. Or well, they actually turned out to be a bit more stubborn than I had hoped, so to speed things up I sailed around a bit and invaded the Spanish Philippines to get some extra war score. When they finally gave in to my demands, all I had to do was lower my relations with the new one province India, justify a war to conquer them, and then declare war. By that time I already had 100% war score on the UK, so following a quick occupation of Goa, I was ready to execute a flawless liberation conquest. Except I got a bit ahead of myself and didn't ensure that India was well and truly ready to surrender unconditionally, so after enforcing the liberation of their course from the British, they didn't immediately agree to surrender. Consequently, all their new lands suddenly rendered my occupation of Goa hilariously insufficient for a complete victory. Fortunately though, my annexation war goal still remained valid, so the only consequence of this miscalculation was that I had to take the time to reoccupy all of India once more in order to get 100% war score. This was a bit annoying and wasted a fair bit of time, but was by no means run-ending in itself. It was a bit awkward though, seeing a mostly unified independent India on the map way before I actually formed them, but what can you do? Having forced the British to cede their directly controlled Indian territory, it was now time for Step 3. Control the Indian princes. To form India, you need to either own or sphere all Indian core provinces. Most of these start under the UK's direct control, with the rest being divided between the various Indian minors, most of which are British puppets, and a few other surrounding countries. The latter group is on the whole simple to deal with, but the puppets are a bit trickier, since you can't easily conquer them as long as they remained under British suzerainty. Luckily though, if you're a great power, you can simply sphere them instead. That actually counts toward the formation of India, even if they're still puppets of the UK. Only the sphere of influence matters. So now that I share a direct border with all the Indian princes, while the UK no longer does, I'm in a fairly good position to just take it easy for the remainder of the run as I wait to sphere them diplomatically. Juggling so many sphere targets at once is a bit annoying for sure, especially since the UK isn't willing to just let them go without resistance. But as long as I'm careful and methodical, I should eventually be able to include every single one of them into my sphere. Or at least every one except those that may get randomly integrated into the UK through the Doctrine of Lapse events. This is a pair of events that can trigger for any Indian state that is a puppet of the UK and which is not yet westernized, and it allows the UK to fully annex them for free. This can still occur even after the British have lost the majority of their Indian possessions. And sure enough, it did end up happening to a few of the Indian princes before I had time to sphere them all. This meant that I would definitely need at least one more war against the UK at some point, to take these few random provinces they now possessed. But that should be far quicker and easier than the last war, so it's not a big deal. Before we get to that though, there actually is one more major foe we'll have to best to secure every Indian core: France. Much like Portugal, they start in possession of a single coastal province in southern India, Pondicherry in their case, which I have to own to fulfill my goal. Although claiming it through war only costs 2 war score, I still held off on starting any wars against France until I was done with the UK, because I know just how stubborn the AI can be even in small colonial disputes like this. Sure enough, once the war was underway, I began to receive some unwelcome visits in India by French allies like Russia, Papal States, and Sardinia Piedmont. But the French themselves instead opted to go for my possessions in Japan, because of course they did. I don't know if it's just me, but it always feels like the AI is far more interested in occupying your faraway colonies rather than going for your heartland, and this was no exception. That's one of the big reasons why I made sure to release Korea and Tainan as satellites. And in fact, I haven't even called them into this war, specifically so that I won't have to deal with defending them. I was unable to rid myself of my territories in Japan, however, but they're at least populous enough that I can raise a decent defense force out of the native population to keep the island free from enemy occupation. While this war raged on, I continued to slowly but surely influence the Indian princes, a process which is even more annoying when you constantly have to shift your attention between monitoring British influence gain and microing your armies. But I knew that with some patience, I'd be able to get them all under my sphere of influence without having to resort to any big war against the United King. Well, screw that plan then. So 5 years had already passed since I signed peace with the British the last time. When with our truce expired and my infamy yet again about the infamy limit, the UK decided to take the initiative and declare a containment war on me. What's worse is that they called in their Indian puppets this time. This is a problem not because they're even close to a threat militarily, but because this is going to prevent me from influencing them diplomatically until not only the current war, but also the following truce is over. In other words, my nice, relaxed diplomatic strategy will now have to be tossed out the window, and in its place a far more sinister plan will have to take shape. The issue with fighting the Indian puppet states is that I can't sign separate peace deals with them as long as they remain puppets. And although I could add war goals on the UK to make them release them, those war goals cost 30 war score each, and thus I can't release more than 3 puppets per war even in the best case scenario. But as luck would have it, there actually is a way to make puppets independent during an ongoing war, and that's by taking advantage of our old friends, the rebels. If rebels, or at least most kinds of rebels, enforce their demands in a puppet state, that puppet will instantly become independent. So all I have to do now is to fully occupy every British puppet and wait for war exhaustion to trigger rebellions, which can then make the puppets independent and thus capable of signing separate peace deals. After playing whack-a-mole with the French alliance for a while longer, they finally admitted defeat and let me annex Pondicherry. Thus, the only significant hurdle left to overcome was the British and their puppets. Once every one of said puppets had been fully occupied, I could have just taken it easy and focused entirely on defense until the rebels did their thing. But instead, as is often the case, I grew impatient. And this impatience would end up having some rather dire consequences. I mentioned that rebels enforcing their demands on the puppet will instantly make that puppet independent. But what is also true is that rebels enforcing their demands on the overlord will instantly make all their puppets independent. So in theory, rather than waiting for each Indian puppet to fall to rebels individually, I could try to force a rebellion in the UK itself and have them collapse instead. But in order to pull that off, I would have to get a significant amount of troops over to the British home islands. Considering the strength of the British Navy, my lackluster naval technology, and just the sheer distances involved, this would obviously not be an easy feat. But I figured there weren't any real threats left to stand against me and that I have more than enough troops to spare. So I began construction of the largest navy that my naval supply limit would allow, packed it with over 100,000 soldiers, and set sail for Europe. Since no one had bothered to construct the Suez Canal yet, I unfortunately had to take the long way around Africa, but I still managed to complete the voyage without losing any ships to attrition. As such, my proud navy could safely sail right up to the Western European coast and then get absolutely obliterated by the Royal Navy. Most ships were destroyed in the battle outright, and those that managed to escape all succumbed to attrition on the journey home. You'd think that a disaster like this would have made me abandon these overambitious invasion plans, but it didn't. In fact, I would end up attempting 2 more invasion plans, one involving walking an exiled army overland all the way to the English Channel, but then they got stuck because of British ships blockading the strait. My attempt to send a fleet of my own to lure those ships away didn't pan out, so then I concocted a third plan. Occupy Gibraltar as an intermediary port, use that to let my ships rest up a bit after the difficult journey around Africa, then load about half of my exiled troops onto those ships. Then I took a long turn around Ireland and attempted to make a landing up in Scotland instead. This actually worked, for about 5 seconds before a larger than expected British army appeared and wiped the floor with my invasion force, while the British Navy sank what remained of my fleet. So that was an unmitigated disaster. in retrospect, I probably should have called this whole thing off before I sent hundreds of ships and hundreds of thousands of troops to the bottom of the ocean, but although we're a bit weakened right now, it should still be fine as long as no major power declares war. Right. Well, that's to be expected. Fortunately, most of these enemies are far away without any land connections nearby, so they shouldn't be too difficult to fend off. I mean, at least I didn't get attacked by someone like Russia. That could have been bad. Okay, not gonna lie, this is starting to get a bit out of hand. I really hope nobody else tries to... Fine, I admit it, I'm in a bit of a dangerous situation here. Nonetheless, I still have a decent amount of troops left in India, and let's not forget the nearly 100k troops that are still chilling around the English Channel. I should probably try to get him home by now, which should be doable as long as France doesn't. So, let's assess the situation. Most of my armies have been destroyed by my own doing, and I was actually struggling to raise any new ones due to a shortage of canned food. I'm being attacked by just about every great power in the old world, and losing these wars would result in multiple containments being enforced on me. This would leave me unable to do pretty much anything for several years, and it would also wreck my prestige to the point that I would no longer be able to maintain great power status. On top of everything, I also started having some serious rebel problems. So that's just the end of the run then, right? There's no way I can turn these wars around from my current position after all, and losing great power status also means losing all my spherelings and resetting a great deal of progress. Well, while it's true I won't be able to win these containment wars, as a matter of fact, I don't actually have to. You see, while all of this has been going on, rebels have begun to pop up in most of the British puppets in India, and one by one they had achieved independence and allowed me to separately piece them out for full annexation. By the time things really started to go to hell for me, only 2 puppets still remained under British control, and only 2 former puppets have been integrated through the doctrine of lapse. This meant that the total war score needed to both free the remaining puppets and conquer the directly held British territory would now be less than 100. So if I could somehow achieve a major victory against the UK, then I might be able to secure all the remaining things I need from them before I'm forced to capitulate in the other wars. But how can I possibly secure a major victory while most of my army is gone and virtually my entire country is being occupied? Well, I have a couple of things working to my advantage. First, earlier in the war, the UK and their allies had occupied my puppet Korea and added several war goals to take territory from them. I managed to liberate Korea from those occupations temporarily, and then enemies from my other wars swept in and occupied the country for themselves. This meant the British alliance could no longer control their own war goals, which would eventually lead to negative war score tickers for them. On top of that, when I annexed some of the former British puppets, this automatically added liberation war goals on the British side to release those countries from me, which will also lead to negative tickers for them eventually. As a result, the longer the war against the UK drags on, the more the war score will turn to my favor as a result of all these tickers. All I really have to do is hold out and try to stop the UK and their allies from occupying my lands, which is actually made easier thanks to all the occupations by enemies in other wars that block out the British alliance. Meanwhile, I can theoretically extend all my other wars indefinitely simply by keeping their peace offers open in the corner of my screen, because as long as I keep those peace offers open, they won't be able to send any new ones, not even if they get 100% war score on me. Lo and behold, as terrible as my situation seemed to be, I eventually managed to get enough war score on the UK to make them accept my peace offer. With that, I now control all the land needed to form India. But there was still one more problem. I can't take the decision as long as I'm at war, and in order to achieve peace, I'll have to accept all the containments that my various enemies want to impose on me. But the final requirement to form India is that you have to have at least 45 prestige, and after surrendering to most of my enemies, my prestige has been reduced down to just 29. What's worse, my nation rank has dropped all the way to 23, which will make me lose great power status after 1 year has passed. If that happens, I will lose all my Spherlings and will instead have to conquer them directly, which is especially problematic since one of the Indian miners is still a puppet of the UK. In other words, I now have to race against time to raise my prestige above the required threshold within a year, or all will be lost. Best way to raise prestige quickly is to enforce certain war goals. But as you know, I was recently contained approximately 1,000,000 times, so what remained of my army had been dismantled and I was barred from raising any new standing armies for another 5 years. Crucially though, even when contained, you are still allowed to mobilize. And although mobilized armies are all infantry, it's still enough to win against weaker foes. And you know who is a weaker foe? Who also just so happens to still hold one of my core provinces, which it took from me all the way back in 1839? That's right, Afghanistan. After quickly mobilizing the 12 regiments available to me, I declared a reconquest war on Afghanistan and set out to defeat them as quickly as I possibly could. By winning a battle or two and receiving a lucky event that gave me some bonus prestige, I was now up to 35 prestige total. But then Japan declared a reconquest war of their own, to retake their cores that I still held on to. Since I had no way of fighting them off at this point, the best I could do was accept peace immediately before they had time to add any more war goals, such as another containment. This defeat made my prestige drop back to 25 though, meaning I now had to get at least 20 prestige more. Enforcing a reconquest war goal only grants you 10 prestige, but the dismantled fortifications war goal also grants you 10 prestige, and it only costs 10 war score to enforce. So after adding dismantled fortifications to my demands and performing a few more occupations, I finally got Afghanistan to accept peace for both my war goals, granting me an immediate 20 prestige bonus and bringing the total up to 47. This was done in the nick of time, as if the war had dragged on just 2 more months I would already have lost my great power status. But as it stood, I now fulfilled all the requirements for the decision, and on August the 8th, 1878, I finally formed the nation of India, approximately 42.5 years after the start of the game. Well, this turned out to be quite a ride. To the best of my knowledge, this is the fastest formation of India starting as Punjab that has ever been done in unmodded Victoria 2. This actually took me quite a few attempts and I'm happy to be done with it. But of course I made some serious missteps along the way, which ended up costing me quite a lot of time. But I am now officially done with this category for the time being, so we'll see when, if ever, I decide to come back to improve upon it. As always, the full unedited run is linked in the description. Thank you for watching and have a good time of day.